Welcome to the Toxics Release Inventory presentation. Today we're going to cover an overview of the Toxics Release Inventory, including basics, tools, and new rules. We're going to go through step 1, which is the threshold determinations, where we're going to talk about reportable chemicals, EPA guidance documents, exemptions, and calculating reporting thresholds. We will then move on to step 2, where we go through the reporting, how to calculate your releases, and then a step-by-step of the report. We'll close with some new and helpful hints. Before we get started, I wanted to share some of the references and tools that we use for the Toxics Release Inventory. You may want to access these during the presentation so you can follow along with us. First is the TRI Guide Me. This is available at the EPA website. The consolidated list of lists available at epa.gov/EPCRA contains all of the EPCRA chemicals, including the SARA 313 or TRI chemicals. It does not have all of the information that we might need for reporting, so we are not going to be working with that today. But I did want to let you know that if this is something that you would normally use, it has been updated for the new year. So if you're working out of an outdated copy, you'll want to get that updated before you start. And then finally is the Central Data Exchange, or CDX. This is where we'll actually go to file our report. The Toxics Release Inventory is required by Section 313 of the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act. We sometimes abbreviate that as EPCRA. This is part of the Community Right to Know side because people have the right to know what hazardous chemicals are present in their communities. This is authorized under Title III of the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act, also referred to as SARA. You may hear this program referenced by many different names, including Toxics Release Inventory, TRI for short, SARA 313, EPCRA 313, Form R, or Form A. Don't be fooled by the nomenclature. These are all referring to the same regulatory requirement. Also note that TRI data is published by the EPA and available to the public. So who's subject to this reporting? Well, if you have at least 10 full-time equivalent employees and are in a covered NAICS code, that's North American Industrial Classification, you are required to at least evaluate whether or not you need to report. Now, how we figure out the 10 full-time equivalency for employees is we take the total number of hours worked by the facility and divide it by 2,000 hours. If the number is 10 or higher, you would be required to report if you are in one of those covered facilities. Those covered facilities include things like mining, logging, certain waste-related activities that are subject to the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, manufacturers, textile mills, food and beverage production facilities, power generations, and distribution companies. There's a full list available in the Guide Me. So if you are subject to TRI, you should complete the threshold determination each year, even if you don't have to file a report. So this is where we're starting at step 1. For the 2023 reporting year, which is due July 1st, 2024, there are 790 individual chemicals and some additional chemical categories that are covered by the Toxics Release Inventory, or TRI. We'll start by identifying the chemicals that are subject to reporting by looking at the Try Me guide. Under the guide, you're going to click on the header for chemical list. Under this list, you're going to find that there are different columns for type, the CAS number, or in the case of a category, you will see a number that starts with an N, and that's the category number that you'll use for your report. The common chemical name, a de minimis limit, and then the reporting thresholds. There's also a column with some explanations if it's needed. You can search on any of these terms, or you can click on the header at the top and you can put them in order. Information on the chemical categories can be found under the Guidance tab. As you can see, there are a number of different categories that we need to keep in mind. It's important to note that the chemicals that are on these lists generally do not show up in the main list of chemicals, so you do want to come out and look at all of the categories to see if you have anything that's applicable. So let's look at an example here. Let's start with certain glycol ethers category. When we click on the link for the certain glycol ethers, we come up with a list of different references that we can access. One of these is the CAS number list of certain chemicals within that category. So you'll see that there are names, synonyms, and CAS numbers for each of these reportable chemicals. I always recommend using the CAS number when looking up chemicals this way, because as you can see, there can be multiple synonyms for each different chemical, but there's only going to be one CAS number for each. Like anything, there are exemptions to the rule, exceptions, and in this case, there are certain items that are exempt from reporting. Items that meet the definition of articles. And an article is something that's going to come in a certain size, a certain shape. And its use depends on its size and its shape and its functions. When it leaves your facility, it's going to look the same as when it came in. Something like that is considered an article. Any chemicals that are in your building for personal use, building and grounds maintenance chemicals, but note that this does not apply to any chemicals that are used for cleaning process equipment. That is not exempt. Motor vehicle maintenance, laboratory chemicals, and reportable chemicals that are below what are called the de minimis concentration in the formula of a mixture that you are evaluating. As a general rule, any chemical less than 1% of a formulation, or in the case of PFAS and carcinogens, less than 0.1%, is considered exempt. So you do not need to include those in the calculations. PBTs do not have de minimis concentrations. I want you to keep in mind that SDS are OSHA documents. These are not created for EPA reporting, and EPA has no jurisdiction over what goes in them. As a normal rule, OSHA does require the same minimum concentrations for listing a chemical in the safety data sheet of 1%, unless it's a carcinogen, then 0.1%. You may not see things like your persistent bioaccumulative toxins in there. Because of that, EPA requires suppliers to inform their customers about these concentrations through supplier notifications. What we found is that these supplier notifications don't always find their way to the people who are doing the TRI reporting, so you'll want to contact your suppliers if you're uncertain as to whether or not you have some of those persistent bioaccumulative toxins, or PBTs, present in the materials that you use. Another important note is that beginning January 1st, 2024, PFAS will also no longer have a de minimis concentration. So for the reporting that's due July 1st, 2025, you will have to report all PFAS, no matter how small the amount is in any of the formulations in your raw materials. There are different activities that are looked at when we are starting to do our calculations for threshold applicability. In order to determine whether a chemical exceeds a reporting threshold, we have to look at how it's used. Manufacture means to produce, prepare, compound, or import, including coincidental manufacture such as a byproduct, and the reporting threshold for manufacturing is 25,000 pounds. Process means to prepare an already manufactured product for distribution and commerce. This does include repackaging. The reporting threshold for processing is 25,000 pounds. Otherwise use is other chemicals that are not considered manufacturing or processing when they're used. A good way to think about this is that a chemical is otherwise used if it does not end up as part of the final product. So for an example, if we are painting and we have paint solvents that evaporate as the paint dries, they don't become part of the final product. So those solvents are considered otherwise used. On the other hand, the paint solids that are left behind after the paint dries will be part of the final product. So if there are any reportable chemicals in the paint solids, those are being considered processed. So your paint might have to be split between both processed and otherwise used for your calculations. The otherwise use reporting threshold is 10,000 pounds. Now let's go back to exceptions to almost every rule. If you have PFAS, your reporting threshold is only going to be 100 pounds. And it doesn't matter whether you've manufactured, processed, or otherwise used those, you will calculate each of those separately. And if any of them exceeds 100 pounds, you have to report. And our PBTs all have different reporting thresholds, and some are quite small. So you do want to go and look at the guide me to find a list of those PBT chemicals and each of their reporting thresholds. There are some fairly common chemicals that are found on the PBT list, including things like lead and lead compounds and mercury-containing compounds. We'll calculate each activity, manufactured, processed, and otherwise used separately. A good place to start looking for information when you're preparing to make your threshold calculations is Section 3 of your safety data sheet. Keeping in mind that we're only going to see our chemicals on there that make up at least 1% or for carcinogens 0.1% of our formulation. Section 15 of the safety data sheet sometimes will include voluntarily more precise information. It could list the 313 reportable chemicals, and it may have some of those smaller concentrations on there. So to do our threshold calculations, then we're going to multiply the weight of a material that we use during the year by the percentage of the reportable constituent. Now, for those of you who do certain type of reporting, like air reporting or air emissions calculations, you'll know that if there is a range that's stated on a safety data sheet, and that's the best information you have on that certain constituent, you're required to use the highest concentration. EPA does not require that for TRI reporting and TRI threshold calculations. In fact, you're allowed to use a midpoint if you have a concentration that is expressed as a range. Now, a common mistake that we see is on our example here, where a range is listed as 1% to 5% of the total formulation. Most people will think half of 5 is 2.5 and will undercount the amount of that material. In order to find the midpoint, you actually have to add the lower and upper concentrations together and divide that by 2. So in this case, our calculation is 1% plus 5% divided by 2 is 3%, and that's what we can use in our threshold determination. If the percentage is listed as a less than, you're going to use the top end of that percentage. And then finally, if your range is listed as a greater than, you will use the midpoint between that minimum percent and the known maximum percent. So in a case like a safety data sheet that says your reportable chemical is present in greater than 60%, but it also lists that 20% of the formula is water, your known maximum there, therefore, becomes 100% minus that 20% of water, and the max you could have then is 80% of the reportable chemical. We can then take the midpoint of the 60% from the safety data sheet and the 80% of the highest known concentration, and we will use then 70% in our calculations. So let's go through an example here of a chemical that's being otherwise used. This company used 67,680 pounds of this particular chemical in the 2023 calendar year. This chemical is made up of 2-butoxyethanol, water, glycerin, ethylene glycol, and a nitric acid magnesium salt hexahydrate. So we'll start looking at these chemicals one at a time. I find that 2-butoxyethanol, under many different names, but I searched by the CAS number, is listed in the certain glycol ethers category. And we can see by our weights between 40 and 45% that it is going to be above the de minimis concentration. Water is not reportable. I look up glycerin and I don't find it in a chemical list or in a chemical category list, so I'm not going to include glycerin in my calculations. Ethylene glycol is present and it is above de minimis concentrations. Now, I do want to point out that we do often see people assuming that because it's got ethylene and glycol in the name that it's a glycol ether. Ethylene glycol is a completely different chemical, so it does not get reported in the certain glycol ethers list. It gets reported separately. And then finally, our nitric acid magnesium salt is found in the water dissociable nitrates category, and it is above the de minimis concentration. So one helpful hint on this, if you see anything that looks like it has a nitric molecule in it, you do want to go to that category and find out if it is listed, because this is one that we have seen manufacturers frequently overlook when they're putting together their supplier notifications and their safety data sheets. So our reportable chemicals are going to be our certain glycol ethers, our ethylene glycol, and our water dissociable nitrates for this product. So for this product, we will multiply the amount used by that midpoint concentration, and we will come up with how much of each of these reportable chemicals we used for this particular product. We are then going to repeat that for other products that are in our facility that have the same reportable chemicals in them. Now we're going to add together all of the otherwise used across our facility and compare it to our 10,000 pound threshold. So here you see we already have product 1 entered. We'll also do this calculation for products 2 and 3 and however many others we have, and add them all together. Now we can see here that our glycol ethers are reportable for 2023 because this is the only one of our calculations that exceeds the 10,000 pound threshold. A quick helpful hint on the water dissociable nitrates and several other similar chemicals. When you're doing this calculation, you do need to use the weight of the entire material. But if you have to go on to report, if you exceed a threshold, you will only report on the nitrate portion of that chemical. There's more information on that in the Guide Me document. This facility also processes some reportable chemicals, and these are reportable at 25,000 pounds. So here you can see that we have calculated glycol ethers, xylene, and toluene all being processed, and we've added together the amount across the facility for all of the different products. Now here it looks like glycol ethers is below the reporting limit, which is true for processing, but remember when we were running that calculation for the otherwise use material, the glycol ethers category was already reportable. So we are going to report this anyhow because it has exceeded in one of these categories. Xylene is reported for 2023 because it is above the 25,000 pound limit. If none of your chemicals exceeded a reporting threshold in step 1, you're done. So all you want to do at this point is keep those calculations on file for the next 3 years. If you did have any chemicals that exceeded a reporting threshold, now we'll move on to step 2, and this is where we actually complete our toxic release inventory. This is done electronically through the Central Data Exchange, or CDX. If you need to report and have not yet registered, you're going to want to do that as soon as you can. You will either register as a preparer or a certifier. The preparer cannot submit and certify the report. That needs to be done by a certifier. And that person should be an individual who's responsible for the facility, such as a plant manager or an officer of the company. We'll calculate our releases of that particular reportable chemical to the air, to the water, and to the land. Some examples for air are fugitive or stack emissions. For water, perhaps chemicals that are discharged to streams or water bodies. And to land, chemicals that are released to the land, including underground injection wells. Remember to include only the reportable chemical portion of those emissions or releases in your on-site release calculations. We're also going to look at off-site releases, and these are things that leave the facility. These could be waste transfers to a broker or to a TSDF, transfers of the reportable chemical to a POTW, which means you've put it down the drain. Be careful that you don't overlook anything, because you do have to include certain types of non-hazardous waste and things that aren't normally otherwise regulated. So non-hazardous waste, scrap metal sold to a metal recycler, even shop towels that are sent to a laundry need to be given consideration for your releases and be reported. Now that we've got our releases calculated, we have to pick our form. You can use Form A, which is the shorter form, if you are not reporting any PBTs or PFAS, if the amount manufactured, processed, or otherwise used does not exceed 1 million pounds for the calendar year, and if the total releases did not exceed 500 pounds. For all other chemicals, you will use a Form R. Now, each chemical gets reported separately. They all get their own reports. So you may find that you have some chemicals from your facility that qualify for Form A and some that don't. So you may file both Form A's and Form R's in the same reporting year. We're going to start with Form R because it is the more complicated of the two forms. Part 1 of Form R is general information. This will include the TRI facility ID number, the name of the chemical that you're reporting, any trade secret claims you might have on that chemical, the name, address, phone number, etc. of the company, the technical contact's name and information, including your phone number and your email address, the name and contact information for the public contact for the facility, your North American Industrial Classification Code, your Dun & Bradstreet number, if it's applicable, and information on your parent company. Part 2 is chemical-specific information. There are 8 sections to this. Sections 1 and 2 are about the chemical, where we're going to put in the chemical abstract service or CAS number, the chemical name or chemical category, the generic name if it's applicable. And then there's a section where we will indicate whether this material is manufactured, processed, or otherwise used. If you are like our previous example company that's both processing and otherwise using a chemical, you will be clicking both of those boxes. It will ask for more information on how those are processed or otherwise used, so be prepared to give that information as well. In Section 4, we'll have the maximum that will be on site at any one time. Section 5 is where we're going to report those on-site releases, including the air emissions, fugitive and stack, releases to water bodies, disposal to land. Section 6 is going to be our off-site transfers, which will include anything we send to the POTW, to a waste broker, a TSDF, a laundry, a scrap recycler, or so on. And then Section 7 is on-site management, which could be on-site waste treatment, recycling, or on-site energy recovery of the material. And Section 8 is going to be a summary of the actual data from prior years, including this year's report and an estimate of future years' reporting, and we go out 2 years. We're going to put in a production or activity ratio, which means a production or activity ratio of 1.0 would mean that there's no change in the amount of production or any type of activity that's taking place at the facility that would increase the amount of the hazardous chemicals that are being released. We'll include source reduction activities. There's also some voluntary information that you can include. So you can voluntarily tell the EPA about source reduction activities that you're taking at your facility, or any other additional information about your report that would be important for EPA to know when they are evaluating your submittal. For chemicals that were managed on site, you'll need to be able to describe the management process. So air emissions treatment could include things like if you have a scrubber, a bag house, any kind of mechanical separation, chemical treatment such as neutralization, physical treatment like adsorption or sludge treatment, on-site energy recovery in something like a kiln, a furnace, or a boiler, and on-site recycling such as metal recycling, solvent recovery, or any other type of recovery that you're doing to reuse a material on site. For chemicals transferred off-site, you'll need to know how that chemical was ultimately managed. What was the type of disposal? Was it put in a landfill, for instance? What type of treatment did it receive? Was it incinerated, possibly neutralized? Was it recycled? Sometimes solvent is distilled off-site for reuse or for resale as a cleaned up solvent product. Sometimes it leaves and goes directly to reuse. And energy recovery as well. And that could be something like fuel blending or something that goes to a waste to energy facility. I want to point out that there is a difference, and an important one, between incineration and fuel blending for energy recovery. Incineration is simple burning to destroy it, and there's no recovery of any of the heat or energy from the material. You're also going to have to tell the EPA for each calculation you give them what the basis for the estimate was. You will report on how you came to your emissions or release amount, whether it was through continuous monitoring or measurements, perhaps periodic monitoring data or measurements. You may use a mass balance. Sometimes we have published emission factors such as those in AP42 or WebFire, particularly for air emissions. Site-specific emission factors like a manufacturer's guarantee or your safety data sheet. There's also other as an option, but be prepared to provide details on other if you do choose that option in your report. Another important thing to point out is that if you have a release of 1,000 pounds or less, you have the option of either putting in the exact amount of the release, or you can select the code applicable to the range that fits the amount of the release. So in this example, we have chromium that was released through a stack in an air emission, and we calculated the emissions at 1.7 pounds for the year. Well, I could use code A that has a range of 1 to 10 pounds in reporting my release. In this case, the EPA will show a release as 5.5 pounds, which is the median for that chromium. Keeping in mind that all of these reports do become public records and people can come and find out what you're emitting, you might want to think twice before you over-report. 4 pounds is a very small amount, but if you're in certain communities, there might be an important distinction between 1.7 and 5.5 pounds. So be sure you want to do that before you use that option. There's also an important difference between 0 and not applicable. By entering 0, you're indicating that it's possible for a chemical to be released, but it wasn't. When you're entering NA, you're indicating that the chemical cannot possibly be released to that medium. So in this case, if our facility, our example, our facility has a reportable chemical, and when we get to the section about releases to the POTW, we realize that there's no way that that chemical is going to get near a drain to get to the POTW. In that case, would you enter 0 or would you enter NA? If you said NA, you're correct. If it cannot get into the drain, then that is not applicable. If it's something that could be poured down the drain intentionally or unintentionally, or released some other way that it would make its way to the POTW, you would then enter 0 instead. Now we'll move on to Form A. Part 1 of Form A is the same as Form R. We're giving general facility information. In Part 2, we are giving the chemical identification that we give in the Form R. So we're going to put in the name of the chemical, the CAS number, etc. And that's it, you're done. You don't even have to report any of your releases because EPA says if your releases are less than that 500 pounds, which qualifies you for the Form A, they are simply not going to ask you to report on that. So if you have the choice of Form R or Form A and you qualify for Form A, use it. One of the reasons we tell you this is the more information you provide to the EPA, the more opportunities you have to get something wrong, and that is a greater risk of enforcement down the road. So new for the 2023 reporting year and things that we're looking for the 2024 reporting year. For the 2023 reporting year, there were 9 PFAS chemicals that were added to the reporting list. So we now have 189 reportable PFAS. You're going to want to review what those chemicals are to see that they're not in any of your raw materials or in any of your products. There were also 12 new non-PFAS chemicals that you'll also want to scan for. Looking ahead to 2024, as of January 1st, 2024, the EPA has removed the de minimis concentration for PFAS chemicals. So you will have to work with your suppliers, make sure you get those supplier notifications. If there's any PFAS in any amount in any of your raw materials or any of your products, you do need to now include that in your calculations for the reporting year 2024 that will be due January 1st, 2025. There will also be additional PFAS chemicals added to the list. So this is a good time to start working with your suppliers to find out what is available so that you save yourself some time next year when TRI reporting comes back around again. A few helpful hints. If you're new to reporting, you do want to request your access to the CDX system as soon as you can. It can sometimes take a few days to get everything worked out and get everyone the clearances that they need to be able to take on the roles that they're playing, either as a preparer or a submitter. Don't reinvent the wheel. If you have existing reports that you can use as a basis for your TRI release calculations, such as your air emissions inventories, waste reports, or wastewater discharge monitoring, rely on those. You don't have to start over. Don't over-report. For example, report only the amount of the waste that included the reportable chemical in your toxic release inventory. You don't want to include everything. And then remember to retain those records for at least 3 years from the time that you filed your inventory. I wanted to close by saying that good record keeping really is the key to smoother TRI calculations and reporting. At SCS, we're happy to help answer any of your questions that you have regarding TRI. We do have experts nationwide, not only in your region, your area of the country, but also in a variety of different industries. And having people familiar with your type of an industry can help them guide you down the right path to a successful toxic release inventory. I'd like to thank you all for attending today.